My brother called me a failed veteran 3 days before his wedding, and the worst part was that he did not even say it like an insult. He said it the way people repeat a fact they have never bothered to check. I was standing 10 feet away in my parents' backyard with a cardboard box pressed against my hip when one of his groomsmen asked whether I had served too. Ethan was holding a beer, laughing about something with the men who had come early to help set up tables, and before I could answer for myself, he grinned and said, "Yeah, Sarah was Army, a long time ago." She never really figured out what came after. A couple of the guys gave polite laughs. Ethan took that as permission to keep going. She does some veteran stuff now, training odd jobs, whatever comes up. Mostly stays close to mom and dad. Then he shrugged and added the sentence I had heard in different forms for years. She never really did anything after the Army. My name is Sarah Bennett. I was 39 years old that summer, and by then I had learned that silence could become part of your reputation if you practiced it long enough. My family thought I came home because I needed somewhere to land. They thought the Army had been the one serious thing I tried before life somehow slipped away from me. They thought the small apartment I kept 2 towns over meant I could not afford anything. Better, that the old truck I drove meant I had never learned to manage money, and that every time I showed up at my parents' house to repair a leaking sink, drive dad to a cardiology appointment, or replace the boards on the back steps, I was filling time because I did not have much of a life of my own. I had never corrected them. There were reasons for that, some good and some that had stopped being good years earlier, but none of those reasons mattered in that backyard. What mattered was that my little brother had just turned 18 years of assumptions into entertainment for his friends. And I was doing what I had always done when Ethan said something careless. I kept working. I carried the box toward the folding tables without looking at him. Inside were glass lanterns Claire wanted for the reception, each one wrapped in tissue paper and packed tightly enough that I could feel them shift when I walked. I had spent 12 years in the Army learning that fragile things rarely broke because of the moment everyone noticed. They broke because somebody had ignored a small problem earlier, a loose strap, a bad angle, a missed check. By the time something made noise, the failure had usually happened already. Families were not much different. Ethan's words did not suddenly create anything between us. They were only the sound of something that had been loose for a very long time. "Easy life," one of the groomsmen said with a grin, not unkindly. He did not know me. None of them did. Retired before 40. "You figured it out better than the rest of us." Ethan laughed. "Pretty much." I set the box down on the table more carefully than it deserved. My hands were steady. They had always been steady when it counted. I could feel Danny Mercer standing somewhere behind Ethan, but I did not look at him. Danny was the best man, an old friend of my brother's, and one of the few people there who had also worn a uniform. I remembered him from years earlier as the older guy who used to pick Ethan up for high school football games when Dad was working late. He had joined the Marines not long after I joined the Army. I knew he had deployed. I knew he had come home with a limp he disguised well. That was about all Ethan had ever told me. Because in our family, people talked about men's wars differently than they talked about mine. Danny had served. Sarah had been in the Army for a while. Mom called from the back door and asked if I could bring another box from the garage. I told her I would. Ethan was already telling a story about his bachelor trip. The moment had passed for everyone except me, and even for me, it was familiar enough that I could have let it go. I walked into the garage, lifted the next box, and carried it back outside. It was heavier than the first one, full of small ceramic pots Claire's mother had made for the tables. Halfway across the yard, the bottom shifted. I caught the box against my chest before it slipped, but the motion pulled my sleeve several inches up my left forearm. I heard Danny stop talking. It was such a small sound that nobody else noticed. A sentence cut short, a breath that did not finish. I looked down automatically and saw what he had seen. The faded black lines on the inside of my arm, a tiny winged medical symbol, the number 31 beneath it, and a set of coordinates I had not looked at closely in years. The tattoo was old, blurred slightly at the edges, nothing dramatic enough for anyone who did not know what it meant. I put the box down and tugged my sleeve back into place. When I looked up, Danny Mercer was no longer smiling. He was staring at my arm with the expression of a man who had just heard a voice from a grave. "Sarah," he said. Ethan glanced over, still holding his beer. What? Danny did not look at him. His eyes stayed on me. Where did you get those coordinates? Nobody laughed this time. I felt 14 years collapse into the space between us. Rotor blades, dust, somebody screaming for a medic, a red light inside an aircraft, a young Marine whose blood would not stay inside his body, a voice on the radio repeating a call sign I had spent more than a decade trying not to hear in my sleep. I pulled my sleeve down all the way and said, "It was a long time ago." Danny, he took one slow step toward me. The color had drained from his face. "Were you on Dustoff 3-1? Behind him, my brother looked from Danny to me, confused and still half smiling, because he had not yet understood that the room he thought he was standing in had just disappeared. I had spent 14 years making sure nobody in my family ever asked me about those numbers. Danny Mercer needed less than 3 seconds to recognize them. 3 days earlier, before Danny Mercer recognized a tattoo nobody in my family understood, I had driven into town just after noon with my duffel bag on the passenger seat and a paper cup of coffee gone cold in the holder. The highway narrowed into the same 2-lane road I had known since I was 17. Past the feed store, the abandoned gas station with weeds coming through the concrete, and the white church where Ethan and I had both been baptized because Mom believed children should have something permanent attached to them before the world started making choices on their behalf. I had been back hundreds of times over the years, sometimes for holidays, sometimes for Dad's appointments, sometimes because Mom would call and say the dishwasher was making a sound she did not like, and I knew from her tone that what she really meant was she wanted one of her children clothes for an afternoon. That child was usually me. Ethan lived 40 minutes away, but Ethan had a schedule. I lived almost 2 hours away, but apparently I had availability. The house appeared at the end of the road exactly where it had always been. A low brick ranch with faded shutters, 2 maples in front, and a driveway Dad had patched so many times that the repairs had repairs. There were already 3 cars parked along the curb, and the front porch was crowded with boxes marked florist, table cards, candles, and do not open until Friday. Claire had organized the wedding with the kind of precision I respected. Ethan had contributed opinions, which was not the same thing. I pulled in behind Mom's SUV, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Coming home had always required a small adjustment, not because I disliked the place. I loved it enough to have spent half my adult life protecting it in ways nobody inside knew. The adjustment was in becoming the version of myself that belonged there. At work, people knew what I had done, at least the parts I allowed to matter. They knew I could teach a trauma class without notes, that I could walk into a room full of nervous new medics and settle it just by speaking slower, that I had spent years in aircraft where bad weather and bad decisions arrived at the same speed. Back home, I was Sarah, the daughter who knew where Dad kept the spare fuses and how Mom liked the gutters cleaned. Neither version was false. The problem was that my family had stopped imagining there might be anything between them. Mom came through the front door before I reached the trunk. She was 66 that year and still moved quickly whenever there was a list involved. She hugged me with one arm because the other held a roll of ribbon and said, "Thank God. The back gate won't latch. Your father says the generator is making a noise. And Claire's mother is coming at 4 with all the table pieces. Good to see you too, Mom." She blinked, then laughed and hugged me properly. "You know what I mean." I do. That was the trouble. I almost always did. Dad was in the garage, pretending to repair a folding chair. He had a screwdriver in one hand and his reading glasses halfway down his nose. The chair did not need repair. He needed an excuse not to be inside while Mom and 3 women discussed flowers. His heart attack had been 6 years earlier, and he had recovered well enough to become dangerous again, which meant he believed any job requiring lifting was still his job unless someone physically removed the object from his hands. "You're early," he said. "You told me noon." I said sometime around noon. "It's 12:07. He looked at the clock on the wall. "Army ruined you. That's what they paid for." He smiled and held out the screwdriver. Gate. There was no question attached to it. I took the screwdriver. The latch on the back gate had sagged because the upper hinge was pulling away from the post. I could have replaced the screws and made it look fixed for the weekend, but temporary fixes offended me more than they should, so I found longer screws, reset the hinge, squared the gate, and checked the swing twice. Dad watched from a lawn chair with a cup of coffee and gave advice after I had already done each thing. That was our rhythm. When I finished, he opened and closed the gate once and nodded. Still got it, apparently. You doing much of this kind of thing these days? Some. What are you doing now exactly? For half a second, I thought he was really asking. Then Mom called from inside that the upstairs toilet was running, and Dad turned his head toward the house and said, "You might look at that before she calls a plumber." The question disappeared as easily as it had arrived. My old bedroom had become a guest room years ago, although Mom still called it mine. She had replaced the posters with framed landscape prints, and the twin bed with a queen, but the closet door still had a shallow dent from the time Ethan threw a baseball indoors at 12, and I stood between him and Dad long enough for him to hide. The glove. There was a garment bag hanging from the curtain rod, with the green dress Claire had, chosen for the family photos, and on the bed was a handwritten note from Mom telling me dinner was at 6, and asking whether I could iron Dad's shirt because he'll ruin the collar. I put my duffel on the floor and unpacked in less than 5 minutes. Toiletries in the bathroom, shoes under the chair, clothes hung by order of when I would need them. Habit. I had spent enough years living out of bags that unpacking was less about comfort than control. On the bottom of the duffel, underneath my civilian clothes, was a small black pouch containing things I had not planned to bring until the morning I left my apartment. An old flight patch, a folded photograph, a set of identification tags. I looked at the pouch for a second, then zipped the bag closed and pushed it under the bed. I had no intention of talking about any of that. This was Ethan's wedding. The house grew louder as the afternoon went on. Claire arrived carrying 2 binders, and somehow still looked happy to see everyone. Her mother followed with boxes of ceramic pots. A cousin showed up with extra chairs. Someone brought a tray of sandwiches nobody had ordered. I moved through it all the way I always did when rooms became crowded, identifying what needed doing before anyone asked. I fixed the upstairs toilet, changed the batteries and 2 smoke detectors, carried 6 boxes to the garage, checked the generator, and found the missing extension cord under a pile of Christmas decorations. Nobody thanked me much, but nobody needed to. Familiar usefulness has its own invisibility. People stop seeing the hand that keeps catching the glass because the glass never reaches the floor. Claire found me kneeling beside the generator just after 4. She was still wearing work clothes, navy slacks, and a white blouse, with her hair pinned up badly as if she had done it at a red light. "You've been here 4 hours and already fixed 3 things," she said. 4. What was the 4th? The gate. She looked toward the backyard. I didn't know the gate was broken. Exactly. Claire smiled. I liked her for that. She had a quiet way of paying attention that made people reveal themselves around her. She sat on the garage step and watched me tighten the battery terminal. "Ethan says you can fix anything." Ethan says a lot of things. That is also true. I glanced at her. She was smiling, but there was something careful behind it. "You nervous?" I asked. "About marrying him?" "About Saturday. Saturday is logistics. Marrying him is the part I already decided." "Good answer." She leaned back against the doorframe. "He's excited you're here." "I know. He talks about you more than you probably think." That caught me off guard enough that I stopped turning the wrench. "What does he say?" Claire hesitated for exactly half a second, which told me more than her answer did, that you've always been the one who shows up. I looked back at the generator. That sounds like him. It did. Ethan loved me. I knew that then, and knowing it made what came later harder, not easier. Families rarely hurt each other in clean categories. Ethan was not cruel. He was comfortable. There is a difference. But comfort can do damage when nobody asks who is paying for it. He arrived around 5:30 in a silver SUV that cost more than my first 3 vehicles combined. He came through the front door talking on the phone, kissed Mom on the cheek without interrupting the call, pointed at me as if he had just remembered something good, and finished the conversation before hugging me. "There she is," he said. "The family utility player. You look expensive." "I am expensive." Claire has receipts. From the kitchen, Claire called, "I heard that." Ethan laughed. He looked good. 35. Fit, confident, tan from some golf weekend he had attended, when I was teaching 23-year-old medics how to keep somebody breathing after the body had started trying to quit. He wore success easily. I had never resented him for it. That is important. Ethan worked hard. He had built a good career. He loved Claire. He called our parents every Sunday. None of that was false simply because he had been wrong about me. He put an arm around my shoulders and squeezed. Seriously, thanks for coming early. Mom would have killed me without you. Mom might kill you anyway. True, best man gets here tomorrow. Danny. You remember him? Mercer? Yeah. Marine guy, fire department now. Still annoyingly responsible. I remembered a 17-year-old Danny teaching Ethan how to drive a stick shift in Dad's old pickup. I remembered hearing years later that he had been wounded overseas, though nobody ever told me where or how. I remembered his name appearing once in a conversation I had deliberately not followed. Been a while, I said. He'll be here by lunch. You two can compare war stories. No. Ethan laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. That night, after dinner and after Mom had assigned me 3 more jobs for the morning, I stood alone in my old bedroom with the window open to the summer air. Somewhere down the hall, Ethan was making Claire laugh. Dad was telling Mom they had too many chairs. The house sounded exactly the way home was supposed to sound. I reached under the bed and pulled the duffel toward me. For reasons I could not explain, I opened the black pouch. The old flight patch lay on top. Dustoff 31. I ran my thumb once across the faded stitching and put it back. By noon the next day, Danny Mercer would be standing in my parents' backyard. By Saturday, he would know exactly who I was. And my brother would learn that the woman he thought had spent 14 years coming home because she needed help had been coming home for almost the opposite reason. I was 4 years older than Ethan, which in our house was apparently enough to make me responsible for most things that could be carried, remembered, explained, or prevented. I do not think my parents ever sat down and decided that. Families rarely make the rules that shape them in a meeting. The rules arrive one ordinary day at a time until nobody remembers choosing them. I was the child who woke up when the alarm rang, remembered permission slips, knew where the spare key was, and could be trusted to walk 3 blocks to the pharmacy without losing the money. Ethan was the child who could make Dad laugh while being actively guilty of whatever Dad had just walked in on. He had dimples, good timing, and the kind of confidence that made adults assume his mistakes were temporary. I had none of those advantages. I had competence, which is a useful thing to have and a dangerous thing to display too early. Dad owned Bennett Small Engine Repair on the edge of town, a narrow concrete block shop that smelled like gasoline, rubber belts, cut grass, and coffee that had been sitting on the warmer since dawn. He repaired lawnmowers, chainsaws, generators, snowblowers, and anything else a customer could unload from the back of a pickup while saying, "It was running fine yesterday." By the time I was 11, I could write up a repair ticket, find most parts in the stockroom, and tell whether an engine was flooded by the smell before Dad pulled the plug. Ethan was 7 then. His main contribution to the family business was spinning on the mechanic's stool until he got dizzy and crashing into the display rack of spark plugs. Once, when he was 9, he took Dad's hand truck and turned it into what he called a race car. I told him not to. That part has become important in my memory because I remember being very specific. I told him the wheel on the right side was loose and that Dad had not fixed it yet. Ethan heard exactly what children hear when an older sister warns them about danger, which is roughly the same thing as permission. He pushed off from the loading bay, got maybe 20 feet, and the wheel folded under him. The hand truck tipped sideways into 3 boxes of air filters. Nothing expensive broke. Ethan scraped his elbow. Dad came out of the office, looked at the mess, then at Ethan, sitting in the middle of it, and started laughing. "You all right, bud?" Ethan held up his elbow like a casualty. Dad rubbed his hair and told him to go inside so Mom could clean it. Then Dad looked at me and said, "Sarah, help me get this straightened up." I remember standing there at 15 with a box of filters in my arms and feeling something I did not have words for yet. It was not jealousy. I loved my brother. I was glad he was not hurt. It was the first clear recognition that consequences traveled differently toward different people. Ethan created the mess and received comfort. I had warned him and received the cleanup. Nobody meant anything by it. That was what made it powerful. It was simply the natural order of the room. The same order followed us home. I checked Ethan's homework when Mom worked late at the county clerk's office. I made grilled cheese when Dad stayed at the shop past 7. I walked Ethan to baseball practice when the truck was tied up with a customer delivery, and I sat in the bleachers doing algebra while he played. If he forgot his glove, I ran home for it. If I forgot something, I learned not to. Mom used to call me her easy child, always with affection. I never have to worry about Sarah, she would tell people. Adults think that is praise. Children hear the rest of the sentence whether anyone says it or not. The worry belongs somewhere else. Ethan loved me in the uncomplicated way. Younger brothers sometimes love the person who keeps the world arranged for them. He followed me around the repair shop when we were small, asked me questions about everything, and waited outside my bedroom when I had friends over because he wanted to be included. When I got my driver's license, the first place he asked me to take him was not somewhere exciting. He wanted to go to a sporting goods store 40 minutes away because they had a baseball glove he had been saving for. He had $38. The glove cost $52. I paid the difference and made him promise not to tell Mom because she would have insisted on paying me back. He kept that glove until the leather split at the thumb. That was the bond between us before success turned it into something harder to measure. I gave Ethan trusted that I would. Neither of us examined the arrangement. By my senior year of high school, Dad's shop had started failing. The big home improvement stores had moved closer, and people were replacing machines they used to repair. Dad kept pretending the numbers were seasonal until even he could not pretend anymore. I would come downstairs late at night and find him at the kitchen table with invoices spread around him, moving figures from one yellow legal pad to another, as though a different arrangement might produce more money. Mom started cutting coupons again. The thermostat stayed lower that winter. Nobody said we were in trouble, which was how I knew we were. I had been accepted to a state university and offered enough financial aid to make everyone celebrate when the letter arrived. Not enough to make the math work, but enough that nobody wanted to ruin the moment by saying so. The remaining tuition looked small when printed in a brochure. It looked enormous next to Dad's accounts payable. Ethan was 14 and already talking about college as if it were a country we had. All agreed he would visit one day. He was good at school when he cared, better at people all the time. And Dad used to say he could see Ethan running a company someday. Nobody had to say what would happen if there was only enough money to save one thing at a time. One night I came downstairs for water and found Dad asleep at the kitchen table with his glasses still on. The legal pad was under his hand. I stood there long enough to read the numbers. Past due supplier accounts, a second mortgage, credit cards I had not known existed. Beside them sat my university packet with the tuition balance circled in blue ink. I understood the problem immediately. That was one of the first things the Army later taught me formally. Define the problem before you become emotional about it. I had learned the habit years earlier in that kitchen. The following week, I walked into a recruiting office and asked questions I had no intention of telling my parents I was asking. I wanted medical training. I wanted a job with purpose. I wanted to leave without leaving a bill behind me. The recruiter talked about benefits, schools, duty stations, and opportunities. I kept returning to one number, what I would cost my family if I went. The answer was almost nothing. At dinner 2 nights later, I told Mom and Dad I was not going to college. Mom stared at me like I had announced I was throwing away oxygen. Dad asked whether the scholarship had fallen through. I told him no. I said I had decided the Army made more sense for me. That was true, just incomplete. Ethan was the loudest one at the table. Why would you do that? You're the smart one. I remember looking at him and thinking how young 14 really was. I'll be fine, I said. Mom argued. Dad tried to argue and failed because the relief on his face arrived half a second before the guilt. I saw both. I pretended I saw neither. Later that night, Mom came into my room and asked me one last time whether I was sure. I told her I was then, because I already knew the decision would cost less if she believed it belonged only to me. I made it sound selfish. I told her I wanted to get out of town. I wanted independence. I was tired of school. I wanted something different. Every sentence contained some truth. None contained the reason. The morning I left for basic training, Ethan stood beside Dad's truck with his hands in his pockets, trying very hard not to look 14. Before I climbed in, he asked, "You're still coming back for my games, right?" "As many as I can. And when I go to college." "You're going. How do you know?" I looked past him at the house, at Dad's truck, at Mom, pretending she had forgotten something inside because she did not want us to see. "Because you are." Years later, Ethan would tell people I joined the Army because I had never figured out what I wanted to do with my life. The truth was that at 18, I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted everyone I loved to keep moving forward, even if I was the one who had to step out of the way. The Army did not make me into a different person so much as give names to things I had already been doing my whole life. Check the equipment before you need it. Learn where the exits are. Listen before you speak. Do the small thing correctly, because the small thing is usually attached to something larger. At basic training, I discovered that being the child who remembered everything was suddenly useful instead of merely expected. I was good at routines, good at staying calm when everyone else was tired, and good at making decisions without needing anybody to congratulate me afterward. None of that felt heroic. It felt familiar. For the first time, the habits that had made me invisible at home made me valuable somewhere else. I trained as a medic first. That part made sense to me immediately. Medicine in the Army was less about having perfect answers than knowing what mattered first. Breathing before pain. Bleeding before fear. The problem in front of you before the problem you wished you had. I liked that order. Bodies were complicated, but emergencies were often brutally clear. Somebody needed air. Somebody needed blood. Somebody needed to stay awake for another 30 seconds. You did what came next, then what came after that, and you kept going until somebody with more equipment took over. A few years later, I moved into flight medicine. The first time I climbed into a MEDEVAC helicopter, I remember thinking it was smaller than I expected. Movies make helicopters look like rooms with rotors attached. They are not. They are machines designed around necessity. Everything has a place because there is no room for anything that does not. The litter goes here. Oxygen here, suction here, blood where you can reach it. Your knees learn where to fit. Your hands learn what they can find in the dark. After enough flights, you stop thinking about the noise and start hearing information inside it. I loved that work more than I ever told anyone at home. When Mom called, she asked whether I was eating enough. Dad asked if the Army was treating me all right. Ethan wanted stories, but only the kind a teenager could turn into something funny for his friends. So I gave him harmless ones about bad coffee, terrible haircuts, and sleeping in places with too many people and not enough privacy. I never told them about the first soldier who died while I was working on him. I never told them how young some of the wounded looked after the dirt and blood were cleaned away. I never described the way rotor wash flattened grass around a landing zone, or how quickly a human being could become the only thing in your entire universe once the aircraft doors opened. Part of that silence was practical. Families worry differently when they can picture things. Mom already worried enough. Dad had spent his whole life believing problems could be fixed if you had the right tool and enough patience. And I did not know how to explain a world where sometimes you did everything correctly and still lost the person. Ethan was building his own life by then. College applications, internships, interviews, the first serious girlfriend. Every time I called home, there was always something moving forward for him. I liked hearing that. I had made one decision at 18, so he would have fewer reasons to look backward. I was not going to turn around years later and make him carry mine. By the time I deployed to Afghanistan, I had learned how to separate my life into rooms. There was the room where I was Sergeant Sarah Bennett, flight medic, responsible for patients, equipment, aircraft procedures, and whatever waited at the end of the radio call. Then there was the room where I was Mom's easy daughter and Ethan's older sister. I did not bring blood into the second room. I did not bring fear into it either. When I called home, I could be sitting 20 minutes away from a mission and still ask Dad whether he had finally replaced the belt on the old mower. I got very good at changing rooms without letting anybody hear the door close. Our aircraft used the call sign Dustoff 31 for a period during that deployment. To most people, it was just radio language. To us, it became a kind of address. When the call came in, somebody gave coordinates, casualty numbers, injuries if they knew them, and whatever threat information had survived the confusion. Then everything became movement. Helmets, gloves, straps, equipment checks. The aircraft lifting before your thoughts had fully caught up. There was no dramatic music. There was only procedure, repeated so often that procedure became the thing holding fear in place. There are people who imagine courage as the absence of fear. I never met anyone like that. The people I trusted most were afraid exactly when they should have been. Fear was information. It told you something mattered. Training told you what to do while it mattered. I flew enough missions that most of them blurred together over time. Roadside blasts, gunshot wounds, vehicle rollovers, heat injuries, Afghan civilians, American soldiers, men who cursed the whole way to the hospital because cursing meant they still had enough air to argue with the world. There were nights I came back and could not remember which patient had belonged to which mission until I checked the paperwork. That sounds cold if you have never done the work. It was not. It was survival. You gave each person everything while they were in front of you. Then you made room for the next one. There was one flight I never managed to file away like the others. It happened in 2011. I was 31. No, I was 24 then. Although memory makes me feel older when I picture myself in that aircraft. We had been on duty most of the day when the call came through. Multiple casualties, marine element, hostile contact ongoing, landing zone uncertain. The coordinates arrived over the radio, and someone read them back twice because they put us in a place none of us liked. I remember looking down at my map. I remember the crew chief saying, "That's tight." I remember writing the coordinates on the inside of my glove because I did not trust myself to forget them. Those were the same numbers I would later tattoo on my arm. My family knew none of this. Years later, when Mom saw me favoring my left shoulder, she assumed I had injured it at a warehouse job I had taken after leaving active service. I let her believe that because explaining the truth meant explaining the flight, and explaining the flight meant opening a door I had kept closed for too long. All I ever told them was that I had been hurt at work. That was technically true. What I did not tell them was that the work had involved a helicopter, a group of Marines who could not get out on their own, and a landing zone that became dangerous before our skids ever touched the ground. I especially never told them about the last man we went in to get. At the time, I did not know his name was Daniel Mercer. By Friday morning, the house had stopped feeling like my parents' house and started feeling like a temporary command post run by people who did not believe in radios. There were lists taped to the refrigerator, garment bags hanging from door frames, boxes under every chair, and at least 3 different versions of the wedding schedule circulating at once. Claire handled most of it better than anyone had a right to. Ethan handled it the way he handled everything important, by speaking confidently enough that other people mistook confidence for control. My mother moved from room to room worrying about things that had already been solved, and Dad kept trying to lift objects heavier than his cardiologist would have approved of. I fell into the middle without deciding to. By 9 in the morning, I had replaced a blown fuse in the garage, found the missing boutonniere boxes, driven Dad to pick up a prescription he had forgotten, and called the rental company because 6 chairs had arrived with cracked backs. Nobody asked me to take over. That was never how it happened. Someone would say there was a problem, and my body would start solving it before my mind had time to ask whether it was mine. Years in the Army had sharpened the habit, but the habit was older than the uniform. At home, usefulness was the closest thing I had to a defined role. Ethan was the groom. Claire was the bride. Mom was the mother of the groom. Dad was trying to stay out of everyone's way while still being involved. I was Sarah, which meant wherever something had gone wrong, I was likely to be nearby making it less wrong. Danny Mercer arrived shortly before lunch, carrying a suit bag over one shoulder and a cooler in one hand. I recognized him before he recognized me. He was broader than I remembered, heavier through the chest, with gray starting at the edges of his beard. The limp Ethan had mentioned was there but subtle, the kind of thing most people would miss, unless they had spent years watching how injured people compensated. He favored the right side going up the porch steps, and when he set the cooler down, he rotated his left shoulder once as if resetting it. Old damage, well managed. His eyes were different too, quieter. Some people come home from war wanting everyone to know where they have been. Others spend the rest of their lives arranging themselves so nobody asks. Danny looked like the second kind. Ethan came out of the house and hugged him hard enough to make the cooler rattle. They started laughing immediately, slipping into the easy rhythm of men with a shared history that did not need explaining. I stayed by the folding tables, taping place cards into groups so Claire could transport them without mixing the seating order. Danny glanced in my direction once while Ethan was talking, then again. I could see him searching memory. I had met him several times when we were younger, but not enough to matter, and 15 years changes a face more than people think. Ethan waved him over. "You remember Sarah?" Danny looked at me properly then. "Yeah, Bennett's older sister. That's me." He shook my hand. His grip was firm but not performative. been a long time. It has. Ethan said you were Army. Army says that too. Danny smiled. What'd you do? The question was normal. Among veterans, it was almost automatic. Branch, job, years, where you were stationed. A map assembled from ordinary pieces. I felt the familiar instinct to keep the answer narrow. Medical, his eyebrows lifted slightly. Medic? Something like that. Ethan laughed from behind him. She does this. You ask her what she did, and she makes it sound like she handed out Band-Aids. I kept my eyes on Danny. Most people don't want the long version. I might. There was nothing aggressive in the way he said it. That was what made me cautious. Men who had actually been there usually knew when another person was closing a door. Danny noticed mine paused and let it stay closed. Fair enough, he said. Claire appeared from the kitchen with a stack of printed menus and asked Ethan whether he had confirmed the transportation for the wedding party. He had not. That turned into a 15-minute problem involving 2 phone calls and 1 argument about whether the hotel shuttle could make an extra stop. Danny helped move tables while I handled the calls. We worked near each other without speaking much. Veterans recognize certain habits even when they do not recognize each other. He noticed that I checked the locking pins on every folding table before letting anyone put weight on them. I noticed that he never stood with his back fully to the open driveway. Neither of us mentioned it. Around 2, one of Claire's cousins sliced the side of his palm, opening a box with a utility knife. The cut was not serious, but it bled enough to panic him and attract an audience. Before anyone found the first aid kit, I had his wrist elevated and a clean towel pressed into his hand. I asked him to open and close his fingers, checked sensation at the fingertips, looked at the depth, then told him he was going to live, and probably keep all 5 fingers if he stopped trying to look at the blood. He laughed nervously. I cleaned the cut, closed it with strips, wrapped it, and told him where the nearest urgent care was if the bleeding started again, or he lost movement. When I looked up, Danny was watching me. You said medical, he said. I was. That wasn't basic medic work. It was a cut. You checked tendon function before you cleaned it. I tied off the wrap and handed Claire's cousin a fresh towel. Old habits. Danny studied me for a second longer. Where'd you deploy? There it was. The next door. Afghanistan. His expression changed only slightly. When? More than once. He waited. I did not fill the silence. Ethan walked past carrying 2 cases of beer and saved me without knowing it. Don't get her started, man. Sarah's classified. He meant it as a joke. Danny did not laugh. I stood up and threw the bloody towel into a trash bag. He'll be fine. Danny nodded, but his eyes stayed on me in a way I did not like. Not suspicion, recognition, looking for a place to land. The rest of the afternoon gave him more pieces. A thunderstorm rolled in just after 4 and forced us to move several tables under the tent. One of the younger groomsmen froze when a stack of metal poles went over with a crash, and I reached for him before I consciously registered that he had flinched. Dad got lightheaded carrying a box, and I had him sitting with water before Mom realized anything was wrong. When the generator sputtered during the storm, I was already outside checking the fuel line while Ethan was still looking for the manual. Claire found me under the edge of the tent after the rain passed. Water dripped steadily from the canvas, and the yard smelled like wet grass and mud. Ethan was across the lawn, telling a story to Danny and 2 other groomsmen. Everybody was laughing. Claire stood beside me and watched him for a moment. Can I ask you something? Probably. Does Ethan always give you jobs when you come home? I looked at her. He doesn't give them to me. She nodded toward the yard. That's not exactly what I asked. I folded the damp extension cord around my hand. Things need doing, and you do them. Usually. Why? The question was simple enough that I almost laughed. Because somebody should. Claire looked toward Ethan again. Does he know how much you do? I'm not keeping score. I didn't ask that either. There was no accusation in her voice, which made it harder to brush away. I shrugged. Ethan's had a lot going on. For 15 years, that got my attention. Claire folded her arms. He loves you, Sarah. I know he does. But every time he talks about you, he says the same things. That you're independent, that you drift around, that you like helping your parents because you don't have anything tying you down. He says it like that's the whole story. It's the story he knows. Is it true? I looked across the yard at my brother. He was laughing with his best man, one hand moving as he talked. perfectly at ease in the center of his own life. I had spent years making sure he could remain there without looking over his shoulder at what it had cost anyone else. Parts of it, I said. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Did he ever ask you for the other parts?" I did not answer. That evening, after everyone had left and the house finally settled, I stood in the bathroom changing the dressing on an old patch of skin near my shoulder that had become irritated from sweat and lifting boxes. The mirror showed the edge of the tattoo on my inner arm when I rolled up my sleeve, the number 31, the faded medical wings, the coordinates underneath. I had gotten the tattoo 6 months after I came home from Afghanistan, before I understood that some memories do not need help staying permanent. Downstairs, I heard Ethan laughing at something Dad said. A minute later, Mom called up the stairs asking whether I could be ready early the next morning because the groomsmen would be there by 10 and they needed help moving the last of the reception boxes. I called back that I would. Then I rolled my sleeve down over the coordinates and buttoned the cuff. By the next afternoon, Danny Mercer would see them anyway. By Saturday morning, the storm had moved east and left the yard washed clean, the grass dark and heavy with water, and the air already warming under a hard blue sky. I was outside before 8 because Mom had left a handwritten list beside the coffee pot with 6 things circled and 3 more added in the margin. By 9, the damaged chairs had been replaced. The reception boxes were stacked by category. Dad had been talked out of climbing a ladder, and I had tightened the loose wheel on the cart we were using to move supplies across the yard. None of that was difficult. The difficult part was keeping everyone else from turning preparation into panic. Weddings make ordinary problems feel like emergencies because people confuse importance with urgency. I had spent enough years around real emergencies to know the difference. Ethan's groomsmen started arriving a little after 10. Judd Parker came first, loud and friendly, carrying 2 trays of coffee and enough breakfast sandwiches for twice the number of people expected. Alec Morrison came next with a garment bag, sunglasses, and a story already halfway told before he was through the gate. 2 other men from Ethan's office followed. Danny arrived last, driving an old gray pickup that looked exactly like something he would own. He nodded to me once as he came through the yard. There was no interrogation in it, but the questions from the day before had not gone away. I could tell, because veterans are good at leaving a subject alone without actually dropping it. The plan was simple. Move the last reception decorations into Claire's mother's SUV, check everyone's suits, then head downtown for the final fitting. The execution was less simple because 6 grown men standing around together reduced the average age of the group by about 15 years. Ethan was in his element. He told stories, assigned jobs he immediately forgot assigning, and made everyone laugh while somehow carrying less than anyone else. I moved through the edges of the group loading boxes, checking labels, and making sure nothing fragile ended up under anything heavy. At one point, Judd watched me reorganize the back of the SUV and said, "You military people really can't turn it off, can you? Some things are easier if you do them right the first time," I said. "That sounds exhausting." "It's less exhausting than doing them twice." Danny smiled at that. Ethan heard us from the other side of the driveway and called, "Careful, Judd. She'll have you inventorying your socks before lunch." The men laughed. I did too. There was nothing wrong with the joke. That is worth saying, because what happened later did not begin with cruelty. It began with familiarity, and familiarity gave Ethan confidence to say things in public he had stopped examining in private. We reached the menswear shop shortly before 11. The place was cool after the heat outside, all cedar hangers, dark carpet mirrors, and rows of suits arranged with more precision than the wedding party deserved. Mr. Alvarez, the tailor, had Ethan on the fitting platform within minutes, pinning the trousers and adjusting the jacket, while the groomsmen spread out across chairs and benches. Dad sat near the front window with coffee. Mom and Claire had gone across the street to pick up alterations, which left me there, mostly because Ethan had asked me to keep track of the garment, bags, and make sure nothing was forgotten. Someone had brought a cooler. Beers appeared. Mr. Alvarez gave the cooler one long look and decided professional survival required ignoring it. The conversation moved through golf, work, marriage advice, and the bachelor weekend. I hung completed suits on a rolling rack and checked the names against Claire's list. Danny sat near the end of the bench, listening more than talking. Every few minutes, I caught him looking at me, then away. I knew what he was doing. He was trying to place something. Maybe the way I handled the injured cousin the day before. Maybe the dates of my deployments. Maybe nothing more than one veteran sensing another had left out most of the story. Judd was the one who finally asked the question. He had no motive beyond politeness. "So Sarah, Ethan said you were Army. What do you do now?" I turned from the garment rack. I had an answer ready because people asked often enough. I trained emergency medical teams, taught trauma response, and did contract work with veteran organizations. It was ordinary work, useful work, and I liked it. I opened my mouth to say exactly that. Ethan answered first. "Depends on the month," he said from the platform. A few men smiled. I looked at him. Mr. Alvarez kept pinning the jacket. Ethan continued, "She does some training stuff. Veterans programs, random contracts. Sarah's never exactly been big on the 9 to 5. Sounds better than my 9 to 5, Alex said. "That's because you actually have one," Ethan replied, and the room laughed. It was still possible for him to stop there. He did not. Judd glanced at me. "You retired Army?" "Not exactly," I said. Ethan lifted both hands while Mr. Alvarez tried to keep him still. "Basically retired from everything before 40. Dad chuckled into his coffee. I felt something tighten behind my ribs, but my face did not change. Ethan was enjoying the room now. He had an audience, and audiences had always brought out the salesman in him. Seriously, Sarah's had the sweet deal for years. Stays close to mom and dad, helps out around the house, picks up whatever work she feels like. No mortgage, no kids, no boss breathing down her neck. She figured out a way to avoid adulthood." There was another round of laughter, smaller this time. Danny did not laugh. Neither did I. Ethan looked at me in the mirror and grinned as if we were sharing the joke. "Come on, Sar. You know I'm kidding." The problem was that I did know. I knew exactly how much of it he believed. Judd gave me an apologetic smile. "Families, right?" I could have corrected Ethan then. I could have said I paid my own rent. I could have said the work I did had contracts, schedules, students, and responsibilities. I could have told him what my yearly income was. I could have mentioned the money that had gone into the house he was talking about, so casually. I could have asked Dad why he was laughing when he knew at least part of the truth. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I let the moment pass. Mr. Alvarez finished with Ethan's jacket and handed it toward me so I could place it on the rack. The hook was higher than shoulder level. I reached up with my left arm, and the cuff of my shirt caught on the edge of the sleeve beneath it. The fabric slid back 4 inches. Enough. The tattoo on the inside of my forearm came into the light, the winged medical symbol, the faded 31. The coordinates underneath. I felt the air change before anyone spoke. Danny had been leaning back against the wall with one ankle crossed over the other. Now both feet were flat on the floor. His beer stopped halfway to his mouth. He was staring at my arm. I pulled the sleeve down immediately. "Too late, Sarah," he said. There was something in his voice that made Judd stop smiling. Ethan looked over. "What?" Danny stood slowly. His face had lost all its color. He did not look at Ethan. He did not look at anyone except me. "Where did you get those coordinates?" I kept my hand on the garment rack. "Danny, don't." His jaw tightened. "Let me see your arm." Ethan laughed once, uncertain now. What the hell is going on? Danny took one step closer to me. His voice dropped so low the room had to become silent to hear it. "Were you on Dustoff 3-1? For 14 years, nobody in my family had ever asked me that question." Danny Mercer asked it once, and I knew from the look on his face that he already knew the answer. For a few seconds, nobody in the shop moved. Mr. Alvarez still had 3 pins between his fingers. Ethan stood on the fitting platform with one trouser leg marked and the other still hanging. Wrong Dad had lowered his coffee but had not set it down. Judd looked from Danny to me with the careful expression people wear when they realize a joke has wandered into a room where it no longer belongs. I could hear the ventilation system above us and the faint traffic outside the front window. Everything else had gone quiet. Danny stood 6 feet away, staring at the sleeve I had already pulled back into place as if the fabric did not matter because he had seen enough. I had known the tattoo might someday mean something to someone. I had never imagined that someone would be my brother's best man. "Danny," I said again, quieter this time. "Let it go." He gave one small shake of his head. "Tell me I'm wrong." Ethan stepped off the platform despite Mr. Alvarez reaching instinctively for the pinned trouser leg. "Wrong about what?" Danny did not answer him. His eyes never left mine. Dustoff 3-1 Afghanistan. Summer of 2011. My father looked at me then, not casually. Not the way he had looked at me 5 minutes earlier, while laughing at Ethan's joke. He looked at me the way a mechanic looks at a sound he has heard for weeks and suddenly realizes is coming from somewhere entirely different than he thought. It was a long time ago, I said. Danny's mouth tightened. Not to me. That sentence landed harder than I expected. I had spent years telling myself the flight belonged to the past because the calendar kept moving whether I was ready or not. People got married. Houses were refinanced. Parents got older. Brothers built careers. You learned to sleep in different rooms. You learned which shoulder not to lie on. You learned to take the back roads on nights when helicopters were training near the highway because the sound could reach inside you before your mind had time to name it. You called that moving on because there was no cleaner word for continuing. Danny had just told me in 4 syllables that the same night had kept living somewhere else too. Ethan looked between us. Can somebody tell me what this is? Danny finally turned toward him, and when he did, the expression on his face changed. Not anger, something heavier. Your sister was on the aircraft that picked up my team. Ethan blinked. Picked you up where? Afghanistan. Nobody laughed. Danny looked back at me. The landing zone was bad. We were taking contact and had multiple casualties. We couldn't move one of our guys. The bird came in short because they couldn't get all the way to us. He paused, and I could see that he was no longer in the shop. There was a medic on that bird. Female. She came off the aircraft when she didn't have to. I felt the old resistance rise immediately. Danny. He stopped. That mattered to me. Even now, even after 14 years of carrying his version of the story, he still stopped when I asked. I exhaled slowly. You don't owe them the whole thing. His eyes moved toward Ethan, then Dad, then the other men. No, but I owe you the truth about what I know. I did not answer. He took my silence for permission. We'd been hit during movement back from a patrol, he said. 1 blast, then small arms. 3 wounded bad enough to need immediate evacuation. 2 could be moved. I couldn't. He touched the side of his abdomen without seeming aware of it. Fragmentation low in the abdomen and hip. I'd lost enough blood that I was starting to check out. The helicopter couldn't put down where we were, so they landed farther out. We started moving casualties to them. Alec lowered his beer to the bench beside him. Danny continued. Then the fire shifted toward the aircraft. The crew was getting ready to pull. That would have been the right decision. They had 2 casualties already loaded and an aircraft full of people who could die if they stayed. I remembered that part differently. Not as a decision. Decisions require options that feel equally real. I remembered the pilot's voice over the headset, the crew chief yelling that we had seconds, not minutes. I remembered looking through the open door and seeing men moving toward us with a litter, then watching them drop lower as rounds struck the dirt nearby. One of them pointed back toward a shallow ditch. There had been somebody else there. Danny. I saw 1 more casualty, I said. It was the first detail I had volunteered. Danny's face changed. I continued before I could stop myself. You were maybe 80 yards out. 2 men were trying to move you. 1 was hit again. They had to break contact. Danny nodded once. Corporal Hayes. Round through the shoulder. He lived. I had never known his name. For 14 years, the man in my memory had been nothing more than the Marine who fell beside me. Litter. I looked away. Danny spoke more quietly now. The medic got out of the aircraft. Judd said almost to himself, under fire? Danny ignored him. She ran to me alone. Not alone, I said automatically. Crew chief came partway. He got ordered back when the aircraft started taking hits. I could hear it again. Metal, dust, radio traffic stacking over itself. My own breathing too loud inside my helmet. Dad sat down slowly in the chair by the window. Ethan's face had gone blank in the way people's faces do when the mind is refusing to assemble information because it does not fit the person standing in front of them. Danny looked at him. She reached me, got a tourniquet high, packed what she could, dragged me far enough to get me onto the litter when the others made another push. I didn't drag you 80 yards, I said. No, you dragged me far enough. There was no drama in his voice. That made it worse, he continued. On the way back, something hit close. I don't know whether it was a mortar round or RPG. I was barely conscious. She went down hard. He looked at my left shoulder. I remember seeing her hit the ground. Dad's eyes followed his. I kept my arms folded. Danny said. She got back up. Mr. Alvarez had stopped pretending to work. The pins were now on the counter. She got me onto the aircraft, and then she worked on me the whole flight. I was bleeding out. I couldn't breathe right. I remember her leaning over me and telling me to stay awake. She kept saying, "Stay with me, Marine. I remember the patch. I remember the number on her gear, 3-1. He swallowed. And I remember those coordinates because when I got home, I found out where they'd picked us up. I wrote them down. I've had them in a drawer for 14 years. I had never known that either. Ethan finally found his voice. "You're saying Sarah saved your life?" I shook my head immediately. "I'm saying we evacuated him." Danny looked at me with something close to disbelief. "Sarah, there was a pilot, crew chief, another medic, Marines on the ground. A lot of people got you out. And if you had stayed on the aircraft?" I did not answer. Danny turned toward Ethan. "Then I would not be standing at your wedding tomorrow." The sentence changed the room. Ethan sat down on the edge of the fitting platform. Dad stared at the floor. I felt every eye move toward me, and I hated it with an intensity that surprised me. Not because I was ashamed, because this was exactly why I had never told the story. A room could turn a person into a single moment if you gave it enough drama. Suddenly, I was no longer Sarah who fixed the gate, Sarah who forgot to buy milk sometimes, Sarah who argued with Dad about his salt intake. I was the woman who ran toward a wounded Marine under fire, and everyone else in the shop had become an audience. I wanted my ordinary life back. "It was my job," I said. Danny looked directly at me. "And I was your job." I had no answer to that. For a moment, neither did anyone else. Then Ethan looked at me and asked the first question I had wanted him to ask for more years than I was willing to admit. "What happened to you after that?" I looked at my younger brother, still half dressed for his wedding, and understood that the story he thought had just changed was nowhere near finished. Because Danny knew what happened on the landing zone. He did not know what happened when I came home, and neither did Ethan. The fitting ended without ever becoming normal again, Mr. Alvarez finished Ethan's trousers because there was still a wedding next day, and somebody had to finish the trousers, but the room had lost its ease. Judd stopped drinking. Alec checked his phone 3 times without reading anything. Dad sat by the window with both hands around the same cup of coffee until it went cold. Danny did not say much after telling the story. He had already said enough. I hung the last garment bag on the rack, checked the names twice, and tried to make myself care about the order because order had always been the place. I went when emotion became inefficient. Ethan kept looking at me whenever he thought I would not notice. On the drive home, Dad rode with me instead of Ethan. He did not ask. He simply walked to my truck and opened the passenger door. We traveled nearly 20 minutes before he spoke. "Your shoulder," he said. I kept my eyes on the road. "What about it?" He looked out the window. "Your mother thinks you heard it moving freight somewhere." I tightened my hands on the wheel. "I know." Dad waited. I could feel the question sitting there, but he never quite asked it. That was our family's talent. We could stand beside the truth for years without putting a hand on it. Finally, he said, "I didn't know." I answered, "I know that too." He nodded once, and we drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. Mom knew something had happened before we entered the house. Mothers develop radar from years of measuring rooms before anybody starts speaking. She took one look at Dad's face and asked whether someone had gotten hurt. Dad said no, then looked at me, and I watched him realize how inaccurate that answer was. I told Mom there had been a conversation at the fitting and that we would talk later. She wanted later to mean immediately. I wanted later to mean after Ethan's wedding. Neither of us got what we wanted. Ethan arrived an hour after us. Claire was with him, but she stopped in the kitchen when he followed me out to the back porch. I knew from the way he closed the screen door that he had spent the drive assembling an argument. My brother had always been good at talking when he knew what outcome he wanted. This time he did not know the outcome, so the words came out sharper than usual. "You let me stand there like an idiot," he said. I looked at him. "That's what you want to start with." He ran a hand through his hair. "What am I supposed to start with, Sarah?" "Danny says you saved his life. Dad looks like somebody hit him with a truck. I find out you were doing things in Afghanistan none of us knew about, and you're acting like I forgot to pick something up from the store." "I'm not acting like anything. You could have told us." "I could have." That stopped him for half a second because he had expected resistance, not agreement. Then why didn't you? I leaned back against the porch rail. Which year would you have liked me to start? What does that mean? It means there wasn't one decision. There were 100 smaller ones. At first, I didn't tell Mom because she already hated the idea of deployments. I didn't tell Dad because he would have stayed awake every night imagining things he couldn't fix. I didn't tell you because you were in school, then starting your career, then building your own life. After a while, not talking about it became easier than explaining why I hadn't talked about it before. Ethan stared at me. That's not fair. No, I said. It isn't. He took that as agreement with him. Exactly. I shook my head. I meant what you said in that shop wasn't fair. His expression hardened. Shame does that sometimes when it has not yet learned how to become regret. I was joking. You believed enough of it to make it funny. That's because it's what you let us believe. His voice rose. You come home all the time. You do odd jobs. You live in that little apartment. You never talk about a real career. Mom worries you're alone. Dad thinks you're getting by on veteran benefits. What was I supposed to think? There it was. Not the wedding. Not Danny, the story underneath everything. I asked, you really think I've been living off Mom and Dad? He gave me a frustrated look. Maybe not literally. But come on, Sarah. You've been leaning on this place for years. For a moment, I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes a lie becomes so complete that the truth looks absurd beside it. Is that what you think? I asked. Isn't it? I looked through the kitchen window. Dad was sitting at the table. Mom stood beside him with one hand on the back of his chair. Claire had not moved. All three of them could see us. I looked back at Ethan. Ask Dad what happened to the house in 2014. His anger faltered. What? Ask him. What does the house have to do with this? Everything. He stared at me, waiting for the explanation. I did not give it to him. For the first time in years, I decided my brother could carry a question without me carrying the answer for him. I opened the screen door and went inside. Behind me, Ethan said, Sarah. I kept walking. Danny had told him what happened on one bad day in Afghanistan. Now he was about to learn what I had done during all the ordinary years afterward. Ethan did ask Dad. I know because 10 minutes after I went upstairs, I heard the kitchen go quiet in the particular way a family kitchen goes quiet when someone has finally asked the question everybody else has been avoiding. I stood in my old room with the door half closed, pretending to fold clothes I had already folded and listened to nothing. No raised voices, no dishes, no television, just silence, which in our family had always been more informative than shouting. I could have gone downstairs. I could have taken over the explanation, put the dates in order, softened the parts that would hurt, made sure Dad did not blame himself and Mom did not blame Dad and Ethan did, not turn his shame into anger again. That was what I usually did when emotional weight started shifting around a room. I distributed it until nobody had to carry too much. This time I stayed where I was. The first voice I heard clearly was Ethan's. What happened in 2014? Dad answered too quietly for me to catch the first sentence. Then I heard Mom say, Robert, tell him all of it. A chair moved. Dad had always hated talking about the year he lost the shop. He called it closing, as if he had simply decided one Friday afternoon that 40 years was enough. The truth was less dignified and more ordinary. Business had been dying for years. He borrowed against the house to keep Bennett's small engine repair alive, then borrowed again because the first loan bought time but not customers. By 2014, the shop was behind on supplier accounts. The second mortgage was late, and Dad had started choosing which envelopes to open based on how threatening the return address looked. Then his heart failed in the middle of all of it. I was still in recovery when Mom called me. Not from the war, not officially. My family still did not know the war had anything to do with why I could barely lift my left arm above shoulder height. I was in a rehabilitation program, learning how to move without compensating for the damage in my back and shoulder when Mom called and said Dad had gone to the hospital with chest pain. She tried to make it sound manageable. That was where I got my talent. She told me the doctors were just keeping him overnight. He stayed 6 days. When I got home, Dad had 3 things waiting for him: a medication schedule, cardiac rehabilitation, and a foreclosure notice he had hidden in a drawer under old tax forms. I found the notice because Mom asked me to look for an insurance card. Dad never asked me for money. That mattered to him then, and it still mattered to me now. He sat at the kitchen table with his hospital bracelet still in his pocket and said they would figure something out. He talked about selling the house, renting somewhere smaller, maybe taking a job at one of the stores that had helped kill his business. Mom cried in the laundry room where she thought nobody could hear. Ethan was in his final year of college and had an internship that could turn into the job he wanted. Nobody had told him how bad things were. I did the math. I had savings. More than my parents knew. Deployment pay I had barely touched. A re-enlistment bonus. Money accumulated during years when I had spent most of my time in places where there was not much worth buying. Later, there would be disability compensation, contract work, and teaching income. At that moment, there was enough to stop the house from disappearing if I moved quickly. So I did. Dad fought me for 2 days. Mom fought me for 1. Then I made them a deal. I would cover the missed payments and enough principal to stabilize the mortgage. I would handle the hospital balance insurance did not cover. They could repay me later if they wanted, but Ethan was not to know. That last part was mine. Not Dad's, not Mom. Mine, I told them Ethan had 1 year left. Let him finish it without deciding he had to come home and save anybody. Let one Bennett child get to walk forward without checking behind him every 10 steps. Dad finally agreed because he understood debt, and I framed it as one. Mom agreed because she was scared. Years passed, Dad tried to pay me back. Sometimes, I let him. Mostly I redirected it into the house. Property tax when the budget was tight. Insurance, a new furnace. Roof repairs after a storm. I never paid everything, and I never wanted the story exaggerated into that. My parents still worked, still sacrificed, still managed their own life. I simply stood under the part of the roof that had started to sag and held it until they could reinforce it. Ethan knew none of that. What he did know was that during his senior year, the financial aid office suddenly cleared a balance he had been worrying about. Dad had told him there had been some adjustment. The adjustment was me. I had covered the rest of the tuition, not because Ethan was helpless. He had worked through college. He had loans. He earned scholarships. He did everything a young man was supposed to do. But there was a final gap, large enough that he had started talking about taking a semester off. I had sent the money to Dad, and Dad paid the school. Ethan graduated on time. He got the internship. The internship became the job. The job became the career he was now proud of. None of that made his success mine. That was never the point. The point was simply that the road had not been as empty behind him as he believed. I heard Ethan say from downstairs, "She paid my tuition?" Dad answered, "Part of it." "How much?" "That's not the question. It is to me." Mom's voice came next. "Then ask the better one." Another long silence. Ethan said, "What better one?" Mom answered with a steadiness I had rarely heard from her. "Ask why your sister was 27 years old, hurt, coming home from whatever she still won't tell us about. And the first thing she did was save this house." I sat down on the edge of the bed. There are sentences you prepare yourself to hear one day. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Why didn't you tell us?" I had imagined all of them at different times and then stopped imagining because expectation is just another way to build disappointment in advance. I had never imagined Mom saying that. Downstairs, Dad began listing things. Not dramatically. That would not have been him. Mortgage arrears, hospital bills, property taxes, the furnace, Ethan's tuition, the year the insurance premium doubled, the roof after the hailstorm. Small things spread across a decade, which was exactly what made them heavy. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally brought me downstairs. "So all those years I thought she kept coming back because she needed you." Mom answered before Dad could. "You thought she kept coming home because she needed us." I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped where none of them could see me. Yet, Mom's voice broke slightly on the next sentence, but she finished it. "She kept coming home because we needed her." I closed my eyes. Danny had shown Ethan the version of me who once crossed open ground for a wounded Marine. My parents had just shown him the version that had frightened me far more to reveal. The woman who came home and never stopped carrying people. Ethan found me on the back porch the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the trees. I had been awake since 5, not because of the wedding, and not because of Danny. Sleep had simply decided it was finished with me. I made coffee, checked the weather, walked the yard once, then sat on the top step with my mug between both hands and listened to the house breathe behind me. For years, mornings like that had been the easiest part of coming home. Nobody needed anything yet. No appointments, no lists, no repairs, no stories about who I was supposed to be. Just a quiet house and enough darkness left that I could belong there without explanation. The screen door opened behind me. I expected Dad. Ethan stepped out instead. He was wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, his hair flattened on one side, and he looked younger than he had in the fitting room. He carried 2 gas station coffees even though I already had one. That made me look at him twice. Ethan had always been particular about coffee. There was a place downtown where he would drive 15 minutes out of his way for a pour-over and complain if the temperature was wrong. The gas station cups meant he had gone out before the good place opened. He held one toward me. I didn't know if you'd made any. I did. Yeah, I figured you probably had. He stood there another second. Can I sit? I moved my mug enough to make room on the step. He sat beside me without touching the second coffee. For a while, neither of us spoke. I let the silence stay uncomfortable. That was new for me. Usually I filled silence for Ethan. Explained, joked, redirected, made the thing easier to carry. I had done it so long that I sometimes mistook it for kindness. I thought you needed somewhere to come back to, he finally said. I looked across the wet grass. I did. He turned toward me. That part was true, I said. I needed this house. I needed Mom calling me about things that weren't life or death. I needed Dad arguing with me about screws and mower belts. I needed a place where nobody knew what Dustoff meant. Coming home mattered to me. He stared at the coffee in his hands. But not because you needed money. No, Dad showed me the records. I said nothing. The mortgage, the hospital bills, my tuition. His voice changed slightly on the last 2 words. I spent years thinking I was the one in this family who made something of himself. You did. He shook his head. Sarah, I mean it. You earned your degree. You built your career. You worked for what you have. Helping you finish college doesn't make your life mine. But I stood in that shop and told people you never figured yours out. Yes, he flinched at how simply I said it. I told Danny you were basically living off Mom and Dad. Yes, he rubbed both hands over his face. Why did you let me? There was no accusation in it this time. That mattered. I considered the answer before I gave it. At first, because you were young. Then, because you were busy. Then, because correcting you meant explaining things I didn't want to explain. After that, I think I just got used to being the version of me that made everyone else comfortable. Ethan looked at me. You could have stopped me. I could have. Then, why didn't you? Because letting you misunderstand me was easier than making everyone feel indebted to me. I paused. But I need you to understand something. I let you misunderstand me. I never gave you permission to disrespect me. His eyes dropped immediately. For a long moment, the only sound was a truck somewhere out on the county road. I know, he said. I'm sorry. Not yet, just that. Then he added, I don't get to feel better fast. That was the first thing he had said since the fitting that made me believe he understood the size of what had happened. No, I said. You don't, he nodded. I keep thinking about every time I said something about you in front of people. Every dinner, every joke, Dad laughing, me acting like I knew your whole life because I knew where you lived. He swallowed. And Danny standing there yesterday listening to me say you never did anything after the army. I watched my brother feel the weight without reaching over to take any of it from him, he said. I don't know how to fix 15 years before breakfast. You can't. He gave a small, humorless laugh. Right. Then he looked at the untouched coffee in his hand. Can I start with breakfast? I finally smiled just a little. That depends. On what? Whether you're cooking. He looked offended. You know I can't cook. I know. For the first time since the fitting room, we both laughed. It did not repair everything. I did not want it to. Repairs that happen too quickly usually fail under the first real load. But Ethan stayed on the porch beside me until Mom turned on the kitchen light. When we went inside, he carried both coffee cups and for once, did not hand me either one to throw away. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply the first morning in a very long time when my brother seemed willing to carry his own weight. By late afternoon, the house had changed again. The panic of preparation was gone, replaced by the strange calm that comes when there's nothing left to fix without ruining something. Claire was dressed. Ethan was dressed. Dad had been told twice not to touch his tie after Mom finally got it straight. The flowers had arrived, the shuttle was on time, and every chair that needed to exist apparently existed. For once, there was no emergency waiting for me. I stood in my old bedroom in the green dress Claire had chosen and looked at myself in the mirror longer than I meant to. The woman looking back at me did not look like the version Ethan had described in the menswear shop. But she did not look like the woman Danny remembered either. She just looked tired, older around the eyes than 39 should have felt, and relieved that the day belonged to somebody else. I had considered wearing something that covered the tattoo completely. Long sleeves would have been easy. Instead, I wore the dress as it was. The mark on my arm was visible if someone looked for it, and invisible if they did not. That felt right. I was done arranging myself around everyone else's assumptions. Danny found me near the side entrance of the reception tent before dinner. He was in his suit, tie already slightly crooked, with a folded piece of paper in one hand. The best man toast, I assumed. He stopped a few feet away and asked, "Can I check something with you?" I nodded. "Anything about Afghanistan," he said. "Anything about me?" I looked at him. He held my gaze and waited. I appreciated that more than he could have known. "No war stories," I said. "Not tonight." He nodded once. "Copy." Then he hesitated. "Your name? What about it? Can I say your name?" "You can say Sarah." The corner of his mouth moved. "Understood." He turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, I'm glad I finally know it. I did not trust myself to answer that without making the moment bigger than I wanted, so I just nodded. He understood and walked away. Ethan approached me 10 minutes later. He had spent the entire day moving differently around me. Not carefully, exactly. More deliberately, he carried his own garment bag that morning. He checked on Dad without asking me to do it. When Mom realized she had left the rings box upstairs, Ethan went himself instead of calling my name. Small things, almost stupidly small. They mattered because they were new. He stood beside me under the edge of the tent and looked toward the tables. "Can I ask you one more thing before this starts?" I knew immediately what he meant. "About the toast." He nodded. "I wrote something last night. Then I rewrote it this morning." "That sounds dangerous." He almost smiled. "I'm serious, I know." He looked down at his hands. "I want to say something about you." I felt my shoulders tighten before he finished. He noticed. "Not the war, not Danny, not the money. None of that." I waited. "Just something true," he said. "But if you don't want me to, I won't." That was the most important part of the question, not what he wanted to say. The fact that he understood the story was not his to take anymore. I said, "You can tell the truth." He looked at me. "Just don't make me the wedding." Ethan let out a breath. "I won't, and no hero stuff. Definitely no hero stuff." "You say that now." "Sarah, I'm trusting you." That stopped the joke. He nodded. "I know. The ceremony was beautiful in all the ways. Ceremonies are supposed to be beautiful when the people involved genuinely want to be there." Claire came down the aisle with her father, and Ethan cried before she reached the third row. Dad pretended not to see it and then wiped his own eyes when he thought nobody was looking. I stood with the family and watched my brother become somebody's husband. For 1 hour, none of the other things mattered. No helicopters, no mortgages, no old jokes. Just Ethan taking Claire's hands and looking scared and certain at the same time. The reception began as the sun dropped behind the trees. The tent filled with music, conversation, silverware, children running between tables, and relatives who believed weddings granted them temporary permission to ask invasive questions. I sat between Mom and Dad at the family table. Nobody had moved me there because of what happened. Claire had put me there from the beginning. I learned that only when I saw the printed seating chart. For some reason, that nearly undid me more than any dramatic gesture could have. Danny's toast came after dinner. He stood with the microphone and unfolded his paper, then looked at Ethan and Claire. He told one story about Ethan getting lost on a fishing trip at 16 and blaming the compass. He told another about Claire being the only person he had ever seen win an argument with Ethan by simply waiting for him to run out of words. People laughed. Ethan laughed hardest. Danny never looked at me. He never mentioned Afghanistan. He kept his promise so completely that nobody who did not know would have guessed there was anything to keep. When he finished, Ethan stood. That was not on the printed schedule. I looked at him immediately. He caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. Then he took the microphone. "I'm going to keep this short," he said, which caused immediate laughter because nobody believed him. "Claire told me if I go over 3 minutes, she gets the house." Claire called from her seat. 2 minutes now. More laughter. Ethan smiled, waited, then thanked her parent. He thanked ours. He thanked Danny. He said the usual things people say at weddings, but for once, he did not sound like he was performing them. Then he paused. I felt Mom's hand find mine under the table. Ethan looked out across the room instead of directly at me. I grew up thinking strength was being the person everybody noticed, he said. The loudest person. The one with the plan. The one who looked like he had everything under control. A few people smiled because everyone who knew Ethan knew exactly what he was describing. I was wrong about that. The tent became quieter, he continued. There are people who do the work before anybody knows there is work to do. People who show up early, stay late, fix things before they become problems, and carry weight without asking anyone to watch them carry it. His eyes moved toward me then, only for a second. I have spent a lot of my life benefiting from people like that, without paying enough attention to what it cost them. My throat tightened. He did not say my name. He did not mention the army. He did not mention money. He did not mention Danny. He simply lifted his glass. So here's to the people who show up early. Claire lifted hers first. Danny followed, then Dad, then Mom, then the whole tent. I lifted mine last. Nobody applauded. Nobody turned toward me. Nobody asked me to stand. That was exactly what I had wanted. Ethan looked at me one more time as everyone drank. There was no request in his face. No demand for forgiveness. No need for me to tell him he had done well. He had finally understood that some things are repaired by what you do, not by how quickly the other person tells you the repair is complete. Later, after the cake had been cut and the band had started its second set, Dad found me near the edge of the dance floor. He held out his hand. Your mother says I owe 3 aunts a dance. Then you're already in trouble. I thought I'd start with the person least likely to complain. That's your first mistake. He smiled. Come on. We danced badly. Bennett family tradition. Dad moved carefully because of his heart, and I adjusted without making it obvious. Halfway through the song, he looked at my arm. Not the tattoo exactly. Just my arm. I told the wrong story about you, he said. I looked at him. He swallowed once. For a long time. You didn't know everything. I knew enough to ask. That was the sentence. Not an excuse. Not a confession designed to make me comfort him. Just the truth. He added, I'm done telling stories about you. I think I'll ask instead. I felt something inside me loosen. That would be a start, I said. Dad nodded. Then he stepped on my foot. I told him cardiac rehabilitation had clearly failed him. He laughed, and we finished the dance. The morning after the wedding, I woke before 6 out of habit and lay still for a while listening to a house that had finally run out of things to prepare for. No phones ringing downstairs. No boxes being dragged across the floor. No one calling my name from the garage. Somewhere outside, a bird kept repeating the same 3 notes from the maple tree. And for once, I did not feel any need to get up and solve something before breakfast. My shoulder ached from dancing, lifting boxes, and pretending for 3 days that 39 was still young enough to ignore an old injury. I rolled onto my back and looked toward the chair where I had left the green dress. The tattoo on my forearm was uncovered in the morning light. The number 31 had faded over the years, but the coordinates were still legible. For a long time, I had thought of those numbers as the location where one version of my life ended. That weekend had changed them again. Now they were also the thing that had forced my family to finally ask who I had become afterward. I packed slowly. That was unusual for me. Normally, I could empty a room in minutes, folding things into a duffel with the efficiency of somebody who had learned never to spread herself too far across a temporary place. This time, I left the bag open on the bed while I showered. I found one of Mom's towels folded at the end of the mattress and smiled because she had been doing that since I was a teenager. On my way downstairs, I could smell bacon before I reached the kitchen. Ethan was standing at the stove holding a spatula like a tool he had been issued without training. Claire sat at the table in one of his old shirts, barefoot, drinking coffee. Dad was reading the same page of the newspaper he had probably been pretending to read for 10 minutes. And Mom was cutting fruit, even though there was already enough food on the table for twice the people in the room. Ethan looked over his shoulder when I came in. Before you say anything, I know the bacon is too dark. It's not too dark, I said. It's evidence, Claire laughed into her coffee. Ethan pointed the spatula at me. You said breakfast was a place to start. I didn't say you were qualified. Mom turned from the counter and asked, "Are you leaving right after we eat?" That was what I had planned. My bag was upstairs. My truck had half a tank. I had a class to teach Monday morning, and there was no practical reason to stay. For years, practicality had been how I made leaving easier. If there was somewhere else I needed to be, nobody had to ask whether I wanted to remain. I looked around the table. Danny was there too, sitting at the far end with a mug in both hands. I had not heard him come in. He had apparently stopped by to return something Ethan had left in his truck, and Mom had done what she did to every human being who entered her kitchen before. 10 in the morning, fed him before allowing him to escape. His jacket hung over the back of the chair. When I walked in, his eyes dropped briefly to my uncovered forearm. He saw the tattoo. This time, nothing happened. His face did not change. He did not ask about Afghanistan. He did not say Dustoff 3-1. He simply moved the plate of toast toward me because it was closer to him. That ordinary gesture nearly broke me. I sat down between Dad and Claire. Mom asked again, softer this time, "Are you staying for breakfast?" I looked at her. "Yeah, Mom." She waited. I understood the real question. "I think I'll stay a while." She nodded as if I had told her the weather. No one clapped. No one made a speech. Ethan burned the second batch of bacon. Dad complained that nobody knew how to cook eggs anymore. Claire started collecting wedding stories that had already become exaggerated overnight. Danny told Ethan his best man speech had run 22 seconds too long. Ethan told him to get out of his house, even though it was not Ethan's house. The conversation moved around me without turning me into the center of it. For the first time in years, I did not feel invisible. I felt included. There is a difference. Before I left that afternoon, Dad came inside while I was loading my duffel. He stood beside the truck with his hands in his pockets and looked at the house. "Mortgage is almost done," he said. I shut the tailgate. "I know," he nodded. "Your mother and I can handle the rest." I studied him for a moment. "You sure?" He smiled. "That's me asking you to let us." I understood immediately. For years, I had treated protecting my family as a permanent assignment. I had never asked whether they were strong enough to take some of the weight back once the emergency had passed. "All right," I said. Dad nodded once. Then he added, "Roof still leaks over the garage." I stared at him. He held the expression for 2 seconds before laughing. "I'm kidding. You're getting brave. I've had a big weekend." I hugged him before he could turn it into another joke. Ethan came out as I was opening the driver's door. He did not have an apology prepared. I was grateful for that. He put his hands on the roof of the truck and said, "Call me when you get home." I told him I would. Then he hesitated and said, "And if Mom calls you because something breaks, call me first." I raised an eyebrow. "You know where the screwdriver drawer is?" He sighed. "I knew you were going to make this difficult. You've got 15 years to catch up." He nodded. "Fair." I drove away with the windows down. At the first stoplight outside town, I realized my sleeves were still rolled above my elbows. I almost reached to pull them down. Then I stopped. The tattoo rested in the sunlight against the steering wheel, old ink over old skin, visible to anyone who happened to look through the window. I left it there. For most of my adult life, I believed leave no one behind meant you kept going back. You carried the wounded. You paid the bill. You fixed the gate. You covered the mortgage. You made the call nobody else knew needed making. You stood under the weight until everybody you loved had crossed safely to the other side. I still believe in that kind of loyalty. I probably always will. What I had misunderstood was the part that came afterward. You are allowed to put the weight down. You are allowed to tell people where you have been. You are allowed to expect the people you protected to learn how to walk beside you. Danny survived Afghanistan because a crew went back for one more Marine. My family survived some hard years because I kept coming home when they needed me. But somewhere along the way, I had turned being needed into the only way I knew how to belong. That weekend taught me something the Army never had to. Being strong does not mean being unseen, and leaving no one behind does not mean carrying everyone forever. Sometimes it means reaching the point where you finally look beside you and realize they are walking too.